Hello, and big welcome here to a kitchen table conversation between me, Rosie Boycott, and David Edwards of WWF. This conversation, and we all have our mugs of coffee with us, this conversation is part of Trade Unwrapped, a project of the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, which has been making huge waves in terms of what it suggests about how we eat and how we farm. And now this is about the really important issue of how we trade. Trade says a lot about who we are as a nation. What do we value? Who do we value? Do we care about the standards that we impose on what we eat, what we bring into the country? Do we care about the environmental damage? Actually, also in truth, do we actually know enough about it? Which always strikes me that trade is seen as something very dull, very not to do with the ordinary person in the street. And part of this campaign and everything that's been going on at the moment has been to try to say, actually, every time you buy something, you are trading. And one way or another, that exchange of cash, your willingness to pick up something, has a ripple effect. And we're going to try and look at some of those ripple effects today with David. So these are a lot of the things that interest me, the way that you bring trade personally into someone's house and into their shopping bag. David, what are your sort of initial feelings about trade when someone says that word to you? Do you yawn, or do you think big opportunity?
Well, thank you, Rosie. As the director of the food strategy at WWF UK, we understand how important food is to the nature and climate crisis. I don't think it's fair to say that we had initially thought that trade would be such a big part of that. But in working out of the UK, we certainly perceived the opportunity for UK leadership on the agenda of food systems transformation. And post-Brexit, I think the question of trade is really about how does the UK deploy its sovereignty that it sort of won through Brexit, if you wish to see it that way, to the ends of a better world, a better environment, a more just and fair world. And that interests us immensely. Food is the primary driver of nature loss. You can say 70% of terrestrial nature loss is through the food system, 80% of deforestation, 30% of climate change. So it is rather important the way that the UK goes about dealing with its food system. And it can't simply do that at home. It needs to do that as part of a global enterprise. So trade, I think, is critical.
How much are we talking about here? I mean, let's try and get a sort of handle on, obviously we have trade within our borders, and we have complicated bills at the moment, like the internal market bills, looking at trade between Wales, Scotland and Ireland, which I think is difficult, but we're talking now really about the global trade. And how much do we depend on that? How much are we bringing into this country and setting standards on it?
Well, the UK, I think it's about half, isn't it, of our food comes from abroad. And of course, we export a good deal as well. So yeah, it is absolutely critical. I think the issue is not so much, this is where we set standards. We set standards for ourselves. The issue for trade is, how do we ensure that the standards that we require of others are commensurate with the standards that we have at home? That's the big issue here, I think. Certainly I know, Rosie, from our work at the Food Foundation together, but we can't really be proud of where the UK is on our sort of nutritional health record. But trade could make things worse, couldn't it?
Well, definitely. I mean, one of the things that always really strikes me very, very heavily and badly is that, for instance, in America, it's been taken now as a given that if you start to label the sugar content of food, that they don't believe that has any impact on consumer choice. Now, if you ever had a message that came more directly from the sugar lobby, well, I'm yet to find one. And you think of applying that to cigarettes, to even contemplate the idea that you would say you would not mention that nicotine is bad for you. And yet, if we go into a trade deal with America, we presumably will have to accept that sugar no longer has to be labelled. And it's been a 20-year fight in this country to ensure reasonably clear on-pack labelling, certainly about the contents of sugar and salt. So the opportunity for a massive backward step in public health is just around the corner if we don't get this right.
Yeah, I do. I agree. I mean, of course, that lack of transparency that we see in the US system, trade deals could indeed open the doors for that. It also opens the doors here to the political economy that you've just alluded to that drives much of the food system in the US. There are systems of subsidy and other support, including this lack of standards that supports the predominance of an industrial agriculture of a scale that just doesn't have a place in the UK. I'm looking at the US in many ways. Their food system is different constructions of corn and soy. That is a problem for the environment. We cannot have these systems that at the scale at which they're applied are a complete threat to nature. We cannot allow for our little country to try to compete with that. And that's what's at stake in trade, is it not?
Yes, I think you mentioned something really interesting in that, though, that, I mean, again, something I think we don't factor in, and that is that question of subsidy. That the fact that the American government does subsidize certain products, and we should detail off what they are, does mean that they would arrive on anybody else's shores far cheaper.
That's right. I mean, the degree of support actually means that these things are created below the cost of production. And there's a good reason the US does that, or had done that during the 20th century, to become a sort of global grain superpower, as it were, and also to open up opportunities for profit and economic growth within its agricultural sector. And that is a very, very complex and robust system. It's not going to be unpicked at any time soon. So the idea that we would just sort of take it as read that we can somehow outcompete that, or that it wouldn't have an effect is really rather fanciful. I mean, in the UK, we don't have a particularly good food system, but at least when you go into the supermarket, or more tellingly, let's say a fast food restaurant or something, and you order a burger, at least that it won't have growth hormone enhanced beef. It won't have chicken that's been raised in such unhealthy conditions that it needs to be chlorinated. It won't have a number, and I think it's about 70 odd pesticides that the UK and others around the world feel are questionable in terms of human health. You at least have that assurance. A trade deal, if not scrutinized correctly, will remove that assurance. And I don't think the UK public is ready for it. If it knew that was at stake, I'm sure it wouldn't be ready for it. I mean, we already know that the survey's done. Do
you feel that we have adequate scrutiny and knowledge about what comes into the out-of-home sector, which is now 40% of what we eat? And it's not that long ago that we were all confronted by the Horsegate scandal. And while I've got nothing against horse meat, I mean, what it did reveal was that even with the pretty tough rules we have at the moment, you could see that, well, meat, supposedly beef, was traveling round and round Europe like a sort of yo-yo. And it's an already pretty Wild West situation out there, even with the rules we've got, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And particularly for environmental harms, the transparency around environmental impact of food. We're just in the infancy of trying to understand how that should be properly monitored and communicated. But we are there. We're taking solid steps. Technology is helping us understand and trace these supply chains, and we're within sight of new regimes of transparency, be it labeling or reporting, and so on. So again, why would we do an about face or open the door to a threat, which is actually really very difficult to remove once you've introduced it, of a system which is looking in the opposite direction? It feels to me like a bit of a betrayal of what we've been up to for the last 10 or 15 years as a country.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And you're WWF, and the disasters of the modern agricultural system on biodiversity loss. And again, how can we use trade to try to preserve? I mean, in Britain now, we're passing an agricultural bill which introduces the system called the ELMS, the Environmental Land Management, which does have faults, but at least starts to recognise that part of farming has to be about the environmental benefits that it gives back to our own natural capital. Doesn't seem to be that, you know, with trade, we're hardly factoring a lot of that stuff in. I mean, is this an area we go towards carbon prices or tariffs? I mean, how can we use our trade to help our environment?
Yeah, well, that's the question we're all asking ourselves, isn't it? I'm smiling throughout that because it's absolutely right. You know, it is a hopeful moment for the UK in some ways. You know, the Ag Bill, the Environment Bill, Henry's National Food Strategy, Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy, you know, the Dasgupta Review, which is going to look at the importance of biodiversity to economies around the world. We are just about there. You know, we have the pieces of the puzzle, but there is this sort of unknown quantity, which is what we do with our trade. Now, it isn't impossible. I think it's actually quite common sense that you could use tariffs, for example, to preferentially grant access to supply chains that are demonstrably more sustainable. We have been working hard at WWF to ensure that the UK government mandates a due diligence on all food companies to ensure that they understand and are addressing their deforestation risk. In ways, this is a way of excluding deforestation risk from the UK in the next year or two. And next year is a hugely important opportunity for us to sort of make those arguments in the context of the climate discussions that we're hosting. So you could quite easily see how you could reinforce that with a regime of tariffs that sort of said, okay, this chicken or this soy feed, more likely, has been grown without deforestation, or even better, grown in a regime that has restored biodiversity in this area, and therefore is subject to a lesser tariff than this other. Because what we're saying there is not differentiating the soy, we're differentiating the outcomes, which are inherently important. There is no way that we can live up to the Paris Climate Agreement unless we stop land conversion and forest destruction. So it isn't the UK being snurgly and say, well, you know, we're trying to reduce Brazilian soy here. It is literally just say, look, in order to get that done, we need to incentivize this type of production system.
And can we apply that to fishing as well, and to countries needing to set up no fish zones around their coasts?
Most certainly. I'm slightly less au fait with the international regimes around fishing, but I think the basic understanding is that if you have set your sights on something in terms of a domestic policy objective, then it isn't impossible to reflect that in your trade policy. So if what is difficult is if you try to game the system and you ignore those same strictures in your domestic production or from some other trading partner. It's that consistency that's required. So
you said, and obviously we, you know, COP coming up. What you have two things, don't you? I mean, we have our own, you know, Great Britain's own trade rules, which we have to set, and then there will be hopefully more stringent WTO rules, which will be arrived at in Glasgow next year. Am I right?
No, I don't think that's necessarily right. No, I think we need to be careful here as well, Rosie. So one of the things that I think we need to be very clear about is that the UK has an opportunity to lead here. The WTO is really, I would describe that as the broom that comes behind and sort of sweeps up the rubbish and makes sure that no one does anything particularly awful. So yes, there is an initiative which I think is important and will gain traction over the next couple of years to try to develop an international regime of like a codex that controls against environmental impact. But that's not really what we're about in striking trade deals. In striking trade deals, we're trying to go understand how you lead a progressive future. So I think we do need to be clear about that. But reflecting, I think it's the COP, is probably what you're talking about, the International Climate Conference that we will host for the first time in Glasgow next year. That is indeed a massively important opportunity. We need to think about coherence, don't we? I mean, we're spending billions of pounds or committing billions of pounds, I should say that, to climate finance. That's a big deal. You know, how does the developed world support the developing world in pursuing green development? Because we need them to. You know, it's important that Brazil doesn't cut down the Amazon because, you know, climate change affects us all. So we've got, I think, 6 billion quid committed, $5 billion alongside Germany and Norway to avoid deforestation. We are struggling, Rosie, really struggling to get that money to work on the ground. So it feels to me just common sense that our trade policy would seek to incentivize the unblocking or the development of the opportunities to deploy that cash. Because as and when we deploy that cash, we get a huge benefit. You know, each one of those pounds that we invest in that way pays us back in avoided costs, you know, many fold over. I mean, you know, the maths has been done, the economics is clear that these things these commitments are made because they help us. So yeah.
Can you give me an example? You used the word struggling. Where are we struggling on a specific basis?
Well, the applying of our climate finance to the avoidance of deforestation. I mean, the deforestation is really nice because it's sort of like, it's a really good lens through which to see. But let's think about, you know, carbon in soils. Would be another one. You know, there's more carbon in soils than there is in the atmosphere. You know, if we were able to build the carbon content of our soils by a fraction of a percent, it could
transform things.
Transform things, absolutely transform things. But trying to apply our climate finance in that way is really awkward because you're driving against a context which is all about cheapest possible production and doesn't incorporate these externalities. So if a trade policy could somehow, you know, point us in the right direction, yeah, it would be.
And do you find that always you come up against the big vested interests of primarily the big food companies who are in the market of cutting down the rainforest, planting, you know, soya where there should have been rainforest and palm oil?
Yes and no. I think that it is impossible and not really useful to lump all business together. So I need to be careful on the ground here, but you know, without a shadow of a doubt, there is a growing realization within businesses, particularly, let's say retail, that we can't continue on, that their business models are being undermined by this, in effect, mining out the natural capital that supports the food system. So you will see that there is leadership there, even within the business community, on this agenda. The difficulty is when you get right down to the companies like the major trading organizations or the input producers who are more intimately linked to that model. You know, they have no alternative at this time to that model. That's a challenge. But we're not saying, I don't think anyone sensible is saying that things need to change overnight, that those businesses are sort of stranded assets. You know, it might be that the assets that they rely upon do become stranded, but it's not going to happen overnight. So really, it is in their own best interest to begin to change now and to lead the charge, because ultimately, you know, it's a law of physics. These things do have to change. You know, the planet can't.
I've been very impressed by how fast business seems to be moving lately. One question, just a couple more questions before we close. What countries do you see doing it right? What can we learn from others?
That's quite a dangerous question in the UK. So I'd like to think that the UK is doing well. I mean, this paying public money for public goods, which is this sort of political realization that we have to support the public goods that our agriculture produces. I think that's pretty leading, actually. You know, in the UK, our ambition for net zero by 2050, and then our NFU's ambition to bring that forward to 2045. These are leading positions. It has to be said that I think that they are aligned to the position that the European Union has had. So I'm being a bit hesitant here because I think we need to be careful here. But we do see the comprehensive food and agricultural policies starting to take hold in the EU. The Council just passed their farm to fork strategy unanimously. This investment in agroecology that comes alongside that, I think it's all really very interesting indeed. And I think what we need to realize, I think, is that next year when the UK is front and centre of the global stage on the environment and climate, it would be really odd if we then demonstrated a sort of backward step from our cousins across the channel who we used to be in lockstep with. It would send a very weak and hypocritical signal, I think, into the international community.
Now, what about the public? Because there have been a lot of, there's been more than I can remember in my lifetime, a sense of public engagement with trade and the beginning of an understanding of it. What more can we do and how important do you see that?
Well, it's definitely hugely important. It's probably our only big lever with the government. But I also think, and I was speaking to others earlier about this, that what we shouldn't do is try to overcomplicate this. You know, trade can be very complicated, but at heart, it is to do with ensuring that we have a rationale for what we want to achieve with trade, and that we pursue that transparently. So it's what are we doing and how are we ensuring that we're doing it? So the other big picture is scrutiny. And I think this is really, really important for the UK at this time. You know, everyone, Brexiteers, Remainers, people of every political hue, they all care about democracy. They all care about the control. The narrative around leaving the EU was that we would have more control. The danger is that because the UK government is so desperate to negotiate good trade deals or trade deals with all license to do whatever they want to do, that they aren't allowing the UK public that transparency. You know, there isn't the mechanisms really for sufficient scrutiny or understanding of the impact of trade deals. And I think if we could just communicate to people that that is at stake, you know, UK public will respond in spades. It's not something that hasn't happened in the past.
Yeah, but I do feel people are much, much more engaged in trade at the moment than I have never known. I certainly feel more engaged in it. So, I mean, one question, I mean, in a way to finish up on this, what are the things we're not doing? I mean, are there gaps? What are the conversations that we aren't having yet? Are there more that, another level that we could get onto about this too?
Well, there's definitely other levels. I mean, but then again, there's other audiences. So the question is, who is your audience? So I think in the minds of the public, I think let's keep it fairly simple. This is about your future, the future of the UK, the bona fides of the UK in terms of its leadership of this agenda. But I think it's important for us to recognise that what we've been talking about here is if the UK doesn't establish these sort of conducive progressive trade arrangements, it will be impossible for countries like agricultural countries like Brazil or Argentina or Congo or to develop in line with the Paris Agreement. So it is absolutely essential for them. It is not all on them. It is for us as developed countries, leading countries, first developing countries, you can see it that way, to use that advantage to help them.
In other words, if we say we're not going to buy animal feed that has been created by deforestation, grown because of deforestation, that starts to push the lever towards stopping the deforestation. Is that it on a simple level?
That's part of it. But what I'm really saying is that isn't a morally just position. You can say that, you have to say that. But at the same time, you have to say, and here is a market for your sustainable product that we will back. Here is where we want you to go. And by the way, here is some help in getting there out of our climate finance and other things. We need, we're in a small country. We can't solve the world's climate problems here in the UK, but we can help others do that. So in the pursuit of what has been called nature-based solutions in countries like Brazil, we should have a trade policy that sort of marries up, helps us to deploy cash in that area.
So it would be if you had your wish, it would be a trade policy that adheres to the policies that we have now, and also would take any other individual product that wanted to come into the country, assess it, and either let it through tariff-free or tariff minimum if it was meeting our standards. And if it was quite out of whack, would it just be a case of putting more tariffs on it, or would there ever be a point where you said no?
I think that's an issue, but I think we have to say no. I mean, the question is the differential that you could ever establish through tariffs enough? And I don't think it is. You know, there's a very good reason that we have chlorinated chicken and these huge, great big industrial, because they can produce things at vastly cheaper cost. So you really do have to say what is forbidden, you know, what is out of order.
So it doesn't matter how much money you were prepared to pay, you still couldn't bring your product in.
Well, I think the two things could marry up. You know, there comes a time where it just becomes unsensible. Yes. But I do think that equally, you know, we reinforce our own position if we can understand what it is that we think is beyond the pale. So you've said protect our standards, and I think that's right. We need to protect the standards that we have, but we really don't have a clear set of core standards. You know, we just have what we've been handed down by the EU. It's time for us to really pay attention to that agenda and say, well, what is it that we have decided is acceptable and unacceptable, and then stand behind it. You know, put some legislation behind it, because the difficulty is if you get this wrong, it is incredibly difficult to unwind. So this is just the issue really is whether legislation is or isn't important, and we definitely feel that it is.
Yes, and so there has to be in the trade bills, agriculture bills, whatever, really a very definitive list at some point of acceptability and non-acceptability, and we have to, as a nation, really think about it. I mean, you know, I for one would absolutely say the notion of a product going out without clear labeling is a benchmark. You do not have that. You know, you do not have certain things, and it would be a very, very good, really big public engagement piece of work, wouldn't it?
I think that's right, and I'm hoping actually that the National Food Strategy
will do that.
Conversation around that will bring that into being, because it surely is so very much needed.
We don't have that much time.
I know. Well, we could talk forever about this sort of thing, and
No, I was thinking about legislation time, and you know, it's all kind of, you know, we're coming out, and we're supposed to have all these deals sorted, and then, you know, set in stone for the X amount of years, and you know, it does feel that one's being pushed against the wall.
To challenge that, though, Rosie, I think we need to challenge that. You know, the idea that we have to have these free trade arrangements is just that's another thing we need to kind of question very much. You know, we could get by without them. You know, the question will be, having them will have a consequence. So what is it that we want out of them? And the problem at the moment is I don't think we know. I don't think the negotiators know. They just want to do business. And I think that is that's a bit of an alarm bell when it comes to food, because it means so much more.
Well, on that note, which I think is cheery, I'm not sure.
we may have more time than we think, but we can't afford missteps.
I know, that's what I feel too, and that I do feel that there is a certain element of railroading going on now. You know, got to get done. You know, and we need to. It's a very interesting point to make, that actually sometimes it's just best to do nothing for a while until we see how things work out. And without a doubt, I mean, you know, the climate agenda is climbing so fast, and all big food companies know that a lot of their methods of production are finite, like many other things. Not quite stranded assets like the fossil fuel industry, but a different kind of asset. So it does feel that we are being a bit railroaded about time and about pushing forward. And the important thing is we keep these conversations going, and we keep telling people why this really matters. You know, it says such a lot about who we are as a country, and in a way how much we value ourselves, or in fact do we think of ourselves as a sort of bargain basement to which anyone is allowed to come and trample on all our standards. So, but David, thank you so much for the time today, and it's been great to have I finished my coffee, I'll go off and get another cup, but that was a really rewarding and interesting and very, very insightful conversation, and I hope that we'll carry on. So bye-bye and thank you.
Cheers.